Fidel Castro was one of the most significant and controversial leaders of the 20th century, a figure who shaped not only Cuba but also the geopolitics of the Americas and the wider world during the Cold War. His life was defined by his fierce resistance to imperialism, his drive for social reform, and his enduring influence on global politics. But his legacy is one that is fiercely debated, with some viewing him as a revolutionary hero and others as a dictator who oppressed his people. Born on August 13, 1926, in the province of Oriente in southeastern Cuba, Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz came from a relatively wealthy family of Spanish origin. His father, Ángel Castro, was a prosperous landowner. And Fidel was raised in a privileged environment that provided him with an education and early opportunities. However, despite his early advantages, Castro's life would take a radical turn as he became increasingly aware of the socio-economic inequalities and political injustices that plagued Cuba. Castro's early political activism began while he was studying law at the University of Havana, where he became involved in student protests and political movements. He was particularly motivated by the widespread corruption of the Cuban government, which was under the control of the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista's regime was notorious for its brutal repression, lack of civil liberties, and close ties to American businesses that exploited the Cuban population. This deeply dissatisfied Castro, who began to believe that only a revolution could bring about meaningful change in Cuba. In 1953, at the age of 26, Castro attempted to launch an armed insurrection against the Batista regime, known as the Moncada Barracks attack. The assault was a failure, and Castro was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, during his trial, he delivered a powerful speech that would become one of the most famous in Cuban history, declaring, "History will absolve me." His defiance against the corrupt government resonated with many Cubans, and after serving only 2 years, he was released under a general amnesty. After his release, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he began to organize a guerrilla movement to overthrow Batista. It was in Mexico that Castro met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor and revolutionary who would become his close ally. Together, they gathered a group of fighters, including several Cuban exiles, and set their sights on returning to Cuba to launch a full-scale revolution. In December 1956, Castro and his comrades, including Guevara, returned to Cuba aboard the Granma, a small yacht. They landed in the eastern part of the island, where they were met with heavy resistance from Batista's forces. The revolutionaries were initially outnumbered and outgunned, but their knowledge of the Cuban terrain and their ability to conduct guerrilla warfare allowed them to outlast their enemies. Over the next 2 years, Castro and Guevara built a formidable revolutionary army, gaining support from Cuba's rural population and disillusioned urban workers. By early 1959, Castro's forces had successfully ousted Batista, who fled the country in January. Castro returned to Havana as the leader of a new revolutionary government. The revolution had wide support among Cuba's poor, who hoped that the new leadership would address their long-standing grievances. Castro's initial promises were ambitious: land reform, better healthcare, education for all, and a focus on social equality. However, Castro's rise to power would also mark the beginning of his authoritarian rule. While many Cubans initially supported the revolution, those who opposed Castro's vision soon found themselves persecuted. Political dissent was not tolerated, and Castro's government began to implement measures that many saw as repressive. Trade unions were tightly controlled, the media was censored, and political opponents were silenced. Thousands of individuals were imprisoned or executed during the early years of his rule, and political trials became common. One of the most significant changes brought about by Castro's regime was the implementation of radical social and economic reforms. Castro's government nationalized key industries, including sugar, tobacco, and utilities, which had previously been controlled by American companies. Land reform policies redistributed land from wealthy landowners to poor peasants, while education and healthcare were overhauled to provide universal access. Castro's regime also established a highly centralized economy, modeled in many ways after the Soviet Union's socialist system. Under Castro's leadership, Cuba became a one-party state, and the Communist Party became the sole political force in the country. The country's relationship with the United States deteriorated rapidly after Castro's revolution. In 1960, the US imposed an embargo on Cuba, which would last for more than 5 decades. In response, Castro aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union, receiving economic and military aid from the USSR. This move led to Cuba becoming a key player in the Cold War and a thorn in the side of US interests in the region. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was perhaps the most dangerous moment in the Cold War and marked the height of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In an effort to counter US nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, the Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. When the US discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade of Cuba, leading to a 13-day standoff between the two superpowers. The world held its breath as the possibility of nuclear war loomed large. Ultimately, the crisis was defused when the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of US missiles from Turkey. Despite the international tensions, Castro maintained his grip on power. Over the years, his government implemented numerous social programs that significantly improved literacy rates, healthcare, and life expectancy in Cuba. Castro's Cuba became a model for socialist movements worldwide, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. However, these successes were often overshadowed by his repressive political practices and the economic challenges Cuba faced, largely due to the embargo and the inefficiencies of the centrally planned economy. While Castro's government was credited with many social advancements, including free healthcare and education, it also became infamous for its lack of political freedoms. Cuba under Castro was often described as a dictatorship, with little room for dissent or opposition. The regime's use of state-sponsored violence, repression, and surveillance became an enduring aspect of his rule. Those who spoke out against Castro or his government faced arrest, imprisonment, and sometimes even execution. As Castro's health began to decline in the early 2000s, his brother Raúl Castro took over many of his duties. Fidel Castro officially stepped down as president in 2008, after undergoing surgery, and Raúl assumed leadership of the country. However, Fidel remained a symbol of Cuban resistance, revolutionary ideology, and defiance of US imperialism until his death in 2016. His passing marked the end of an era in Cuba, but his legacy continued to shape the country's politics and policies. Fidel Castro's legacy is as complex and divided as the history of Cuba itself. To many, he is seen as a hero who stood up against imperialism, fought for social justice, and transformed Cuba into a country that was no longer at the mercy of foreign powers. His policies, particularly in education and healthcare, lifted millions of Cubans out of poverty and gave them access to services that many other countries in the region could not provide. Under his leadership, Cuba achieved impressive advancements in education, with literacy rates soaring to nearly 100%. The country's healthcare system became renowned for its efficiency and for providing universal care, even for the poorest citizens. These achievements were the product of an ideological commitment to social equality and the belief that the state had a responsibility to care for its citizens. At the same time, Castro's policies left a deep scar in terms of political freedom. The Cuban state under his rule was one of the most tightly controlled in the world. Political opposition was crushed, and dissent was seen as a direct challenge to the revolution. The government routinely engaged in surveillance of its citizens, with informants placed throughout Cuban society. Political prisoners were often held without trial, and those who attempted to flee the island in search of a better life were punished. Thousands of Cubans made dangerous attempts to cross the Florida Straits to reach the United States, risking their lives in search of freedom and economic opportunity. For many, the repression and lack of political freedoms overshadowed the social achievements that Castro's government had made. Fidel Castro's role in international politics further complicates his legacy. Throughout the Cold War, Castro's Cuba was a focal point for global ideological conflict. His alliance with the Soviet Union made Cuba a key player in the Eastern Bloc and a constant thorn in the side of the United States. Castro was unrelenting in his support for revolutionary movements around the world, sending Cuban troops to fight in conflicts in Africa, particularly in Angola, where they helped to support left-wing governments against apartheid forces and Western-backed insurgents. His foreign policy was built around the idea of spreading socialism and supporting oppressed peoples, but it also led to accusations of Cuban imperialism and interference in the internal affairs of other nations. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war in 1962, remains one of the most pivotal moments in history. Castro's decision to allow the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil was a gamble that put not just Cuba but the entire world in jeopardy. Castro himself later claimed that he had been kept in the dark about some of the key details of the negotiations between the Soviets and the Americans, and that he had not fully understood the implications of the missile deployment. However, the crisis demonstrated the extent to which Cuba had become a pawn in the Cold War, and it was a reminder of the immense pressure that Castro faced as the leader of a small, isolated island caught between two superpowers. Over the decades, the U.S. embargo on Cuba became a central issue in the relationship between the two nations. For Fidel Castro, the embargo represented the long-standing economic and political war waged against Cuba by the U.S., a war that he framed as a struggle for national sovereignty and independence. He often used the embargo as a rallying cry, portraying Cuba as a David standing up to the Goliath of American imperialism. This stance earned him the support of many developing nations and left-wing movements around the world, who admired Cuba's resilience and defiance in the face of such intense pressure. But for ordinary Cubans, the embargo meant hardship. The Cuban economy suffered immensely under the trade restrictions imposed by the United States, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 dealt a devastating blow to the Cuban economy, as Cuba lost its primary source of economic aid and trade. The Special Period, as it was known, was a time of widespread scarcity and suffering in Cuba. Food shortages, power cuts, and a severe lack of basic goods marked the era, and the Cuban people were forced to adapt to a difficult and often desperate situation. Despite the government's attempts to mitigate the impact of the crisis, many Cubans were left with a deep sense of frustration and a desire for change. In the years leading up to his retirement, Fidel Castro faced increasing criticism from within his own country and from the international community. The Cuban economy remained stagnant, and many of the promises of the revolution had not been fully realized. The leadership under Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, would begin to open up the Cuban economy in small ways, such as allowing limited private enterprise. But the political system remained unchanged. The calls for greater political freedom, including multi-party elections and free speech, were met with resistance by the Cuban government, which continued to view dissent as a threat to the revolution. Fidel Castro's health problems in the late 2000s marked the end of his direct leadership, but his influence continued to loom large. Raúl Castro's reforms, which included some limited economic liberalization, were seen by many as a necessary step for Cuba's survival in the post-Soviet world. Raúl also made efforts to engage in dialogue with the United States, culminating in a historic thawing of relations under President Barack Obama in 2014. Castro, though no longer in power, remained an iconic figure, representing both the enduring spirit of the Cuban Revolution and the difficulties of maintaining a socialist state in a rapidly changing world. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era for Cuba, but it also prompted renewed debate over his legacy. For some, Fidel was a visionary who stood up for the poor and marginalized, transforming Cuba into a symbol of defiance against imperialism. For others, he was a tyrant who stifled freedom, maintained a one-party state, and impoverished his people with failed economic policies. Castro's passing was met with a mixture of mourning and celebration, both within Cuba and abroad. In Cuba, the government declared 9 days of mourning, and his funeral was a grand affair, with thousands of Cubans gathering to honor their fallen leader. But outside of Cuba, many saw his death as the closing of a chapter in history, one that had been defined by the struggle between socialism and capitalism, revolution and counter-revolution. Fidel Castro's story is one of triumph and tragedy, of hope and despair, of revolution and repression. He was a man who changed the course of history, who led his people through war, adversity, and isolation, and who stood as a symbol of defiance against the dominant powers of the world. His legacy, however, will always be shaped by the complexity of his actions and the contrasting views of those who lived through his rule.